today are looking at the 60th time the word spirit is used in the Bible. So this verse actually uses it twice. We're going to be able to see that God is stirring up the heart of Pul and Tiglath-Pileser, though his name is spelled differently here. We've just prayed together, and we're going to go right into what the Bible says here, trying to continue to understand what it is that's being said. So notice in 1 Chronicles 5:26, the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tilgath-Pilneser, but that's how to say it here. But this word, if you just went ahead and searched for the key number, you'll find it only comes up 6 times, and it's Tiglath-Pileser. In this one, it's not Tilgath-Pilneser. So it's spelled a couple of times differently, like in this one that we're looking at here. That one is spelled differently. Well, same thing in this other Chronicles. It was just the way that the chronicler, whoever that was that wrote these things, was writing that name. But what's fascinating is, this is something you may not have known, but Ellen White actually named her dog Tiglath-Pileser. And so they called the dog Tiger, or Tig for short. And so if you knew a little bit about that history, you'd find it funny because, many times I'll refer to dogs as Tiglath-Pileser just based on that fact. So here we go, that the God of Israel stirred up the spirit, or the mind, the desires, the purposes of Pul, and the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. And he carried them away. Even the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the tribe of Manasseh. Now those were God's people. The Reubenites, the Gadites, the Manasseh. So Pul and Tiglath-Pileser were not. The Assyrians were pagan, but the God of Israel stirred up the mind of the pagans to bring punishment upon his people. And that punishment came with being able to take them away. Now, that's really interesting because it has happened otherwise, not just here, but you can see that the nations of the world have often been used by God to punish God's people. And that's a different study in and of itself, but just find it interesting and search for it yourself someday. Now, this is really quite interesting too, because Saul, we've talked about before, where he went to the one that had a familiar spirit. That word is ob, if you remember, and that word is here referred to again as a familiar spirit. The only other time it's translated is bottle. And so this time where Saul died, he died for something. And he died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had that familiar spirit to inquire of it. And I'm going to go into a little bit of context here and read the next verse. And he inquired not of the Lord. Therefore, he, the Lord, slew Saul, him, and turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse. And so, for being somebody who is in responsibility, like Saul was, and then turning away from God and going against the word or spirit of the Lord, he went to a different spirit for counsel, and purposefully going to Satan to find out what he needed to know, God slew him. Okay, that's a real heavy statement there. Now, you won't find that in Samuel, but you do find it in Chronicles, so it is interesting to compare the two. Now, going on to the next one, this is the 62nd verse. Then the Spirit came unto Amasai, who was chief of the captains, and he said, Thine are we, David, and on thy side, thou son of Jesse. Now, so God's Spirit came into the mind of this man who was one of the leaders, right, the chief captain. And he was speaking for those that were with him to say, David, we're on your side. We believe that God is with you, your God helps you, and David received them. So God was helping through the ministration of his agents to put into the mind of Amasai to bring all of these people to support David. Because David was the king, Saul was not. There was this big issue going on in the kingdom, and God was using his agents to stir up the people to support David in this case. So that was the mind of the Lord brought to the mind of a Messiah, and it was through one of the agents. You can just find, of course, the consistency, especially when you read the writings of Sister White. There's a great consistency in the Spirit of the Lord being brought to humanity through the ministration of holy angels, because they're the ones, remember, that ascend and descend upon the ladder. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 12, the pattern of all that he had by the Spirit of the courts of the house of the Lord, and all the chambers round about, of the treasuries of the house of God, and of the treasuries of the dedicated things. Now, this is really quite interesting, because what you'll find here is that David, in fact, let me just go to the context real quick. I'm going to show you that if you go one verse up, David gave to Solomon, his son, the pattern. Okay? So David gives the pattern to his son. Now, it's the pattern of all that David had been given by the Spirit. And you're wondering, like, how did the Spirit come and tell David? Well, I've got some notes that you might be interested in. The Lord, through his angel, instructed David and gave him a pattern of the house which Solomon should build for him. And an angel was commissioned to stand by David while he was writing out, for the benefit of Solomon, the important instructions in regard to the arrangement of the house. First Spirit of Prophecy 38, 7.2 or 387. That's really quite interesting, because there you have that answer to this conundrum. If in fact you were asking the question, how would you know that the angel came and instructed David? Well, because the Spirit doesn't float around by itself. The Spirit is given by the intelligent instrumentalities that God uses, in this case, those that are in heaven. So the Spirit of all that he had by the angel, so David was instructed by the angel, and David was giving to Solomon all that he had through the angel. That's how God communicated with Solomon all the way from heaven down to the earth. And that's really quite interesting. So you might want to put that one down. I do actually have a message online that's entitled Angels in the Old Testament. And that's where I gathered that note from, was from a previous study I'd already done. Just this morning I remembered, you know what? I put that down somewhere, and so I went and found it, and there it is. So if you're interested to go through that presentation, you might be interested that there is a whole lot in the Old Testament that people like me, when I used to think as a Trinitarian, would apply to the Spirit, some third being. And it would do all these things, but then you realize, like, what's the good of the angels? Why are they even here? There would be no use for them. But then when you start studying, and you realize that God the Father, represented by the Shekinah glory, the Son of God, represented by the high priest, and then the priests, represented by all the angels, or vice versa, you would realize that, wow, it makes good sense, even in the sanctuary, that God uses his agents to do ministry for all those that were surrounding his tabernacle. And so going back now to the Bible and looking at the next verse, it says in 2 Chronicles 9:4, the meat of his table and the sitting of his servants, the attendance of his ministers, the apparel, his cupbearers also, their apparel, his ascent by which he went into the house of the Lord. There was no more spirit in her. We've already talked about this word. That was the Queen of Sheba. And the Spirit of God came upon Azariah, the son of Oded. And you can see in various cases the Spirit of God comes upon people, and it's interesting to see what they say, but in many cases it is that he is speaking. In this case, Azariah is speaking for God, right? You'll see more of that in just a moment. That's why I'm skipping it. And then we've already read this already in the Kings. It's chapter 20, I believe it is. And so I'm not going to go into it now. I'm just going to read it quickly so we can remember. There came a spirit, and it stood before the Lord. So it was an angel that stood. Spirits that are disembodied don't have legs, but an angel does. And so the Spirit came and stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him. Remember that story? I will go and be a lying spirit, or I will put lying thoughts into the mind of those prophets, and in their mouth they will speak words that are false. That's what that's basically saying, okay? Now therefore, behold, the Lord had put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets. Zedekiah the son of Chenaanah came near and smote Micaiah. We already read about this yesterday. And he said, when did the Spirit of the Lord go from you? or rather from me, and speak to you? And the answer, of course, is when he had turned his mind away from God. So in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 14, upon Jehaziel, the son of Zechariah, the son of Benaiah, I'm just going to skip the names, came the Spirit of the Lord in the midst of the congregation. So what did he do? Go and look upon this for yourself. What he did is he preached the word of the Lord. And he was able to give education to God's people. So now, in 2 Chronicles 21:16, moreover, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines. Now, against Jehoram, it was the Lord using the Philistines and the Arabians that were near the Ethiopians to come against Jehoram, okay? And that's because God was punishing his people again. And you can just read the history of that. But the spirit, the mind of, hey, I'm going to go get you guys, was put into the mind of these Philistines, Arabians, etc. Now, the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, which stood above the people, and said, Thus saith God, why are you transgressing and going against the commandments? So when the Spirit of God comes upon his people, many times they'll preach. And that's why it's so interesting when Sister White says that the golden oil it's actually Zechariah chapter 4 that she's commenting on, but she says it more clearly, where she says, the holy angels pour from themselves the golden oil upon those who are preaching the word of God. So in this case, when it says the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, it was the Spirit of God being poured forth from the angelic ministers into the mind of Zechariah, and he was able to speak the word of the Lord to the people. And so the closer we are to understanding how we get the holy oil, I think the better we are when we're speaking, because then we have the ability to be one of those channels that God is using to be able to communicate what is truth. Going back now to 2 Chronicles 33, verse 6, he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Also he observed times and the enchantments, used witchcraft, and dealt with those that had familiar spirits, and with wizards. He wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. So I don't know who this is right here in this time. I could go look, I'm sure. But it was Hezekiah, his father. So I think it was the son of Hezekiah. I don't remember. Oh, there it is, Manasseh. Manasseh was 12 years old. He was the son of Hezekiah. And remember, Hezekiah, he actually was the one who said, Lord, I don't want to die. I want to be able to live, so please heal me of this sickness. And he was healed. He lived for 15 years. And it was here that his son, at 12 years old, started to reign. And it ended up being a horrible experience for Israel, because Hezekiah whined about God's timing when he should have died. And it would have been better for the kingdom, I'm sure. But God gave him his life, okay? I'm going to use you as an example for everybody else following. When they read your story, they're going to recognize that sometimes when you're sick, you don't need to whine and fuss about continuing to live. You just simply accept the will of God for your life. And in this case, the son, Manasseh, did a horrible experience in God's kingdom, which was Israel. And so that's a really hard story to deal with. But he was right here, as it says in 2 Chronicles 33:6. He caused his children to pass through the fire. He was dealing with witchcraft and wizards. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Why? Because his father didn't want to die. Okay? That's a serious thing. 2 Chronicles 36:22. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah. So somebody came upon Jeremiah or near Jeremiah to educate him, right? The word of the Lord was given or spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah. So it was given to Jeremiah to be spoken by Jeremiah, that it might be accomplished. Oh, wait, sorry. I get it. Jeremiah wasn't even alive, but Cyrus, so that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. So the mind of Cyrus, just like the previous pagan kings, God inspired this pagan king to do something for his people. In this case, instead of punishing the people, he was actually setting them free. That a proclamation throughout all the kingdom would be made, put in writing, as it says, you can read in Chronicles for yourself, But a similar thing is explained here in Ezra. In the first year of the Cyrus, the king of Persia, the word of the Lord came by the mouth of Jeremiah, that it might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made all the proclamation throughout his kingdom, put it in writing, and said, "Go forth." Basically, you can read it if you want. And so, again, the mind of the Lord was put into the mind of a pagan king. Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all them whose spirit God had raised. So whose mind God had inspired. Like, hey, I think you guys ought to go and build the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. And they're like, yeah, I think that's a good idea. If you accepted that idea from God, then you have God's mind within you, okay? So I think it's really interesting that God was stirring up the spirit of people and causing them to go to fulfill his will. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 20. You gave your good spirit to instruct them, and you did not withhold the manna from their mouth, and gave them water for their thirst. Now, who was this? Nehemiah is actually recounting the history of the children of Israel. So think about it for a second. Nehemiah is writing, you gave also your good spirit to instruct them. What does that mean? Well, the way we've been trying to understand this is that the mind of God has been given to his people. But how? Well, the mind of the Father up on top of the ladder in Genesis chapter 28, verses 11 through 13, was demonstrated by his words. God spoke when he was up on top of the ladder. There were angels. Angel means messenger. The angels were ascending and descending with the messages that God had as he was speaking from the top of the ladder, and they gave the instruction to Jacob, the prophet, at the bottom of the ladder. And so God gave his good spirit to the prophets. Who were the prophets when God was calling people out and giving them manna and water in the wilderness? It was Moses, Aaron, and the sister Miriam. And so God was able to instruct his people, giving the mind or spirit of them, the spirit of the Lord to instruct them through his agents. So I find it, again, consistent with the same things we've been learning from our previous studies about the angelic ministry and the Spirit of God, the mind of God, and the connection that we read about in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, where it says God gave a revelation to his Son, who gave it to an angel, who gave it to the prophet, who gave it to us, and then we're to give to others. Same thing that happened in the wilderness with the children of Israel. So now going back to Nehemiah 9:30, many years did you forbear them, and you testified against them by your spirit in your prophets. So how did his spirit get into the prophets? The Father gave it through his Son, who gave it through an angel, who gave it to the prophets. Now, it doesn't say that here, but that is the way the Bible describes the ministration of God through his Son and through the angels and through the prophets. So though it doesn't say it here, that's what it means, because that is God's mode of operation. And so I do have a presentation, if you're interested. It's called What is the Spirit of Prophecy? And that will help put into place this idea of the Father through the Son, through the angels, through the prophets, to you and then to others, so that it'll show from the Bible that we are actually part of God's communication network. It's not like God speaks directly to prophets and then that's it. No, you're part of this. You're part of actually the tools that God is using to spread his word to all the kindreds, tongues, and nations. And so it's quite exciting to me. Now, I think I'm going to stop here at this point because I'm not feeling very well today. And Job has a lot of references to the Spirit. So I'm just wondering, is there any thoughts or communication that you might want to share that is either helpful or clarification, or even contrary to what I shared today, that you could help us understand better? Is there something that you feel like could be explained that way? Okay. I'm not hearing any comments, so I'm thinking that it's clear to you, but there we go. Good. Thank you, Rob and Brooke. We appreciate the message. So this one was shorter, and partly because yesterday I got a illness in my head, and I picked it up for my kids, but Yeah, thank you. Go and rest and heal. But even the comment that Sister White made in, I believe it was the first Spirit of Prophecy, where David received instruction from God. Oh, thank you, Jim. That one comment from Sister White just helps make it so clear. How did David get the instruction to write the information about the temple? It was from God through his agents, through the angels. How did Moses get instruction about writing the blueprints for the ark? It was from God. And no, that was Noah. Did I say Moses? I meant Noah for the ark and Moses for the tabernacle, but David for another tabernacle. All those things were from God through his agents, and it was definitely the instruction of angels. And so the more we understand the network that God has established, I think the more we can understand the importance of our understanding what God is saying. You see, because if God is trying to teach us his will, and then we go and share what we think is his will, but it's not really his will, then we're being a false witness. We're actually misrepresenting God's truth. And then we're not on God's team. God uses truth. So the better we understand the truth, the more consistent we will be with witnessing, and the more effective we will be with witnessing. So really, our own personal study, our own divine intelligence, if you will, his instruction to our minds, the better we will be for his service. And we can co-work with the angels, because they, the holy angels, they only use what's right. They don't use what's wrong. They don't, I mean, God can use it, I get it, like with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar misunderstood a lot of things, but God was using him. And he does that a lot with people. But what I'm saying is the more effective you can be is based upon how much you understand the truth. And so our own personal studies is really important. And we will be instructed by angels, just as David, just as Moses, just as Noah, just as Adam and Eve, just as Jesus Christ. And I want to be that way. So let's bow our heads asking for God's blessings. And thank you so much, Jim. And I do pray that God will do that too. But let's pray and ask for God's blessings upon our study and the purposes that he's been giving us through. Lord of heaven, I ask that you bless us as we have been able to study together. We thank you for giving us the life and the health. I know this little bit of a illness that I have is just going to go away soon, and I thank you for that. But we ask that you'd continue to bless us, that we can effectively share with those who do not understand the truths that we've been able to learn, and that this message of your kingdom will go around the world as quickly as you see fit, so that we can be prepared for the perilous times that are coming before us, so that after that your Son will come and we will be taken to your kingdom in heaven. Thank you for giving us this time, and bless us today in Jesus' holy name. Amen.